Listen, world, Iran deployed 1,000 strategic drones to our bases in Burkina Faso yesterday. Long-range Shahed 136 attack drones. Each carries 50 kilograms of explosives. Range exceeds 2,000 kilometers. Every Western base within range is now a target. France is panicking. Pentagon is scrambling. They are scared. This is your last warning. Attack us and burn. Let me show you exactly what happened. 1,000 Iranian strategic drones arrived at Burkina Faso military bases yesterday in largest single deployment of Iranian military technology to Africa. In history, transforming strategic balance in West Africa and fundamentally changing calculations for any Western military. Intervention in the Sahel region by providing capabilities that make attacking Burkina Faso or allied nations equivalent to inviting devastating retaliation against Western military installations across the entire region and potentially beyond. Deployment was conducted openly with transport aircraft landing at military airfields in broad daylight carrying disassembled drones and support equipment and Iranian technical personnel who will train Burkinabe forces and maintain systems ensuring operational readiness. Satellites from United States and France and other Western nations observed entire deployment process, watching helplessly as strategic capability arrived that completely undermines their military planning, and that makes Operation Metro Surge and similar interventions far more costly and far more dangerous than Pentagon assumed when developing invasion plans based on assumption that Sahel nations lack capacity to strike back effectively against Western forces. Iranian Shahed 136 drones are proven combat systems that demonstrated effectiveness in Ukraine, where they struck Ukrainian infrastructure and military targets with precision despite Ukrainian air defenses and despite Western-supplied air defense systems attempting to intercept them. Drones proved difficult to detect on radar due to small size and low-altitude flight profiles, making them hard to track until they're close to targets. Drones prove difficult to intercept even when detected because their low cost means that defenders must expend expensive missiles worth hundreds of thousands of dollars to destroy drones worth tens of thousands of dollars, creating unfavorable exchange ratio that makes defending against mass drone attacks economically unsustainable. Drones proved effective at destroying high-value targets, including power stations and fuel depots and command centers and ammunition storage facilities, demonstrating that relatively simple and inexpensive weapons can cause strategic damage when employed in sufficient numbers against targets that cannot be protected completely due to resource constraints and geographical dispersion. Each Shahed 136 carries 50-kilogram warhead sufficient to destroy most military targets, including aircraft parked on airfields, fuel storage tanks, radar installations, command buildings, barracks, and similar structures, making them lethal against soft targets that militaries depend on for operations. Warhead uses shape-charge design optimized for penetrating structures and causing maximum internal damage, ensuring that successful strikes disable or destroy targets rather than merely damaging them superficially. Guidance system combines GPS navigation with inertial backup, enabling drones to strike targets with accuracy measured in meters even if GPS jamming attempts to disrupt guidance. Terminal guidance reportedly includes optical targeting for final approach, allowing human operators to adjust aim in last moments before impact, ensuring precision against mobile targets or targets that moved since mission planning. Range exceeds 2,000 kilometers, enabling strikes against targets across West Africa and into North Africa and potentially into Southern Europe depending on launch locations and flight profiles chosen. 2,000-kilometer range from Burkina Faso bases puts French military installations in Senegal and Ivory Coast and Gabon within easy reach, requiring flight times of only few hours. Range puts American staging bases being prepared for Operation Metro Surge within reach, whether they're located in neighboring Sahel countries or in coastal West African nations cooperating with Pentagon. Range puts European military bases in Mediterranean region potentially within reach if drones are launched from northern Burkina Faso or from allied nations closer to Mediterranean coast. This range transforms strategic situation because Western militaries planned interventions assuming their bases were safe from retaliation and assuming that Sahel nations could be attacked with impunity, but now must consider that every Western military installation within 2,000 kilometers becomes legitimate target once hostilities begin, making cost of intervention far higher than previous calculations assumed. Every Western base within range is now a target that can be struck with little warning and with little ability to defend completely, because defending against mass drone attacks requires air defense systems that most bases lack and requires ammunition stocks that would be exhausted rapidly if attacks continued for days or weeks. French military base in Senegal hosting fighter aircraft and transport aircraft and special operations forces becomes target that could be destroyed through coordinated drone strike, destroying aircraft on ground and killing personnel in barracks and destroying fuel supplies and ammunition stocks, eliminating French capability to conduct operations in West Africa without months of reconstruction and reinforcement. American staging bases in Ghana or Ivory Coast or Benin being prepared for Operation Metro Surge become targets that could be struck before invasion even begins, destroying aircraft and equipment before they can be used against Sahel nations, preventing Operation Metro Surge from launching and forcing Pentagon to either abandon invasion or to accept delay while forces are repositioned at locations farther from Sahel, requiring longer flight times and reducing operational effectiveness. French bases in Gabon and Chad and Djibouti become targets, potentially putting entire French military presence in Africa at risk if conflict escalates beyond Sahel region, forcing France to choose between accepting destruction of bases or withdrawing forces to safer locations in Europe, abandoning century of military presence in Africa. European bases in Mediterranean, including Spanish bases and Italian bases, could potentially be targeted if Iran provides longer-range variants or if drones are launched from locations closer to Mediterranean, creating risk that European nations supporting American intervention face attacks on their own territory, bringing war home to European populations that assumed they were safe from retaliation due to geographical distance from Africa. This extended range creates deterrence because European governments must consider whether supporting American regime change operations in Africa is worth risking attacks on their own military installations and potentially on their own territories, making political cost of supporting intervention far higher than when intervention seemed risk-free from European perspective. France is panicking because deployment eliminates French military advantage in West Africa that Paris relied on for maintaining influence in former colonies and for conducting interventions whenever African governments threatened French interests. French military strategy in Africa assumed air superiority, allowing French jets to strike ground targets without facing significant anti-aircraft threats, and assumed that French bases were safe from retaliation, allowing operations to be conducted from secure rear areas without worrying about base security. Iranian drone deployment eliminates both assumptions by providing Sahel nations with capability to strike French aircraft on ground before they can take off, and by making French bases vulnerable to attack, forcing France to either massively increase air defense deployments protecting bases or accept that bases could be destroyed in opening hours of any conflict. French military lacks sufficient air defense systems to protect all African bases simultaneously because France has only limited numbers of advanced systems and because protecting dispersed bases across vast African geography requires more systems than France possesses, meaning that some bases will remain vulnerable regardless of how France allocates resources. French government recognizes that losing African bases would end French military presence in Africa permanently because domestic French politics won't support rebuilding bases after they're destroyed through military action that French public opposed from beginning. French public, already skeptical about military interventions in Africa, questions why French soldiers should die for regime change operations serving no clear French national interest. French public, already tired of terrorism blowback from African interventions that contributed to attacks in Paris and Nice and other French cities, questions whether African involvement makes France safer or more vulnerable. Losing bases and losing soldiers in drone attacks that French military couldn't prevent would generate massive political backlash, forcing government to explain why France maintains African military presence and why French bases were vulnerable to attacks from relatively simple weapons and why French military superiority couldn't protect French personnel, leading likely to withdrawal from Africa that French foreign policy establishment fears because African military presence represents last remnant of French great power status, and losing it means accepting that France is medium European power rather than global power with worldwide military reach. Pentagon is scrambling because Operation Metro Surge planning assumed American air superiority would be established rapidly through strikes against Sahel air defenses, followed by freedom of movement for American aircraft conducting close air support and strike missions and transport missions without facing significant threats. Iranian drone deployment changes calculation by introducing threat that American air defenses must counter before they can focus on establishing air superiority over Sahel nations themselves. American forces must now defend staging bases against potential drone attacks, requiring deployment of Patriot air defense systems or other advanced systems protecting bases and requiring 24/7 alert status, maintaining readiness to intercept attacks that could come at any time. This defensive requirement diverts resources from offensive operations and creates logistical burden transporting and maintaining air defense systems, and creates vulnerability because air defense systems can be overwhelmed through mass attacks using more drones than interceptors available, meaning that determined attack will likely succeed in destroying some targets even if most drones are intercepted. Pentagon generals recognize that Operation Metro Surge timeline is no longer feasible because preparing adequate defenses for staging bases and for forces deploying into theater requires additional time beyond 90-day window that original planning assumed would be sufficient for achieving regime change. Pentagon generals recognize that Operation Metro Surge casualty estimates are no longer accurate because drone attacks on bases could kill hundreds of American personnel before invasion even begins, rather than casualties occurring gradually during ground operations as original planning assumed. Pentagon generals recognize that Operation Metro Surge political sustainability is questionable because American public support collapses rapidly when casualties occur from attacks that seem preventable, making drone strikes on bases politically devastating in ways that combat casualties during operations are not because public accepts that soldiers in combat face risks, but public doesn't accept that soldiers at supposedly secure bases should be killed through attacks that military should have prevented. Pentagon is also concerned about precedent that Iranian deployment sets because if Iran can deploy drones to Burkina Faso, then Iran can deploy drones to any nation willing to host them, creating potential for Iranian strike capabilities to appear globally wherever American military operates. Venezuela could host Iranian drones threatening American bases in Colombia and threatening American naval forces in Caribbean. Nicaragua could host drones threatening American forces in Central America. Syria obviously already hosts Iranian capabilities threatening American forces in Iraq and threatening Israeli territory. Yemen, controlled by Houthis allied with Iran, already demonstrated drone and missile capabilities threatening American naval forces and threatening Saudi Arabia and threatening Red Sea shipping. Cuban hosting of Iranian drones would put American mainland potentially within range, creating Cuban Missile Crisis level threat that would dominate American politics and force massive military response. Pentagon generals are begging Biden to cancel Operation Metro Surge not because they fear military defeat in narrow sense, but because they recognize that strategic costs of invasion now far exceed potential benefits, making operation counterproductive from perspective of American global interests. Military defeat in narrow tactical sense remains unlikely because American forces possess overwhelming technological superiority and numerical advantages and logistical capabilities that Sahel nations cannot match even with Iranian and Russian support, making it probable that American forces could achieve initial military objectives including destroying government facilities and neutralizing military resistance and occupying key cities if invasion proceeded despite Iranian drone deployment. But tactical military victory matters little if strategic costs undermine broader American interests, and if operation demonstrates vulnerabilities that adversaries can exploit globally, and if political sustainability of occupation proves impossible, making withdrawal inevitable after costly period of futile attempts to stabilize puppet governments that lack popular legitimacy and that face sustained resistance supplied by external allies. Pentagon generals understand difference between winning battles and winning wars, and understand that Operation Metro Surge could win initial battles while losing strategic war by demonstrating American vulnerabilities and by consuming resources and by generating global resistance that undermines American power more than conquest of Sahel nations would enhance it. Invading Sahel and facing drone retaliation against American bases would demonstrate that American military installations globally are vulnerable to attacks from relatively inexpensive weapons that adversaries can deploy through proxy forces, making every American base worldwide potential target. American military strategy depends fundamentally on network of overseas bases, providing forward presence, enabling rapid deployment to crisis regions, and providing logistic support for power projection and hosting forces that reassure allies and deter adversaries. This base network includes hundreds of installations across dozens of countries, from major bases in Germany and Japan and South Korea, hosting tens of thousands of troops, to small facilities in Africa and Middle East and Asia, hosting hundreds of personnel supporting specific missions. Entire network depends on assumption that bases are secure rear areas where forces can prepare and rest and refit without facing significant threats, because host nations provide security and because adversaries lack capability to strike bases effectively. Iranian drone deployment in Burkina Faso and subsequent strikes against Western bases if invasion proceeds would shatter this assumption by demonstrating that even small nations with support from Iran or Russia or China can acquire capabilities to strike American bases, causing significant damage and significant casualties, making bases vulnerable rather than secure. This demonstration would embolden adversaries globally to develop or acquire similar capabilities and to threaten American forces wherever they're deployed, undermining American military presence that depends on perception that American bases are secure and that American forces can operate without facing significant retaliation. China would recognize that providing drone technology to nations hosting American bases creates leverage, allowing China to threaten American forces without directly engaging American military and without risking escalation to major power conflict, while still imposing costs on American military presence in regions where China seeks predominant influence. Russia would expand drone exports to American adversaries, including Venezuela and Nicaragua and Syria, and potentially Cuba, creating drone capabilities near American territory and near American forces deployed globally, forcing Pentagon to deploy air defenses protecting every American installation worldwide, consuming resources and creating impossible logistics burden. Iran would accelerate drone proliferation to partners across Middle East and beyond, creating comprehensive threat networks surrounding American forces throughout region, making American military operations far more costly and far more dangerous than current environment where American forces enjoy relative security from Iranian retaliation, except through proxies that Iran supports but doesn't fully control. North Korea would seek drone technology enabling strikes against American bases in South Korea and Japan, threatening tens of thousands of American troops and threatening hundreds of thousands of American citizens living in those countries, creating hostage situation that constrains American military options during any crisis. Pakistan would acquire or develop drone capabilities threatening American interests in South Asia and potentially threatening American forces in Afghanistan if any remain or in surrounding countries. Various non-state actors including terrorist groups and insurgencies would seek drone technology enabling attacks against American forces and American interests, globally creating proliferation challenge that counterterrorism efforts would struggle to contain because drones are relatively simple to operate and relatively difficult to defend against comprehensively. This global proliferation would fundamentally transform security environment for American forces, making forward deployed posture far more costly and far more dangerous than current situation where American technological superiority provides substantial protection against most adversaries most of the time. Losing aircraft and personnel to drone attacks before invasion even begins would represent humiliating military failure, demonstrating that American military cannot protect its own forces from attacks by small African nation with support from Iran, creating perception of American weakness that would undermine deterrence globally and encourage challenges to American power. Deterrence depends critically on perception that challenging American interests results in swift and overwhelming military response, making challenges too costly to attempt and making adversaries choose accommodation over confrontation. But deterrence also depends on perception that American military forces are secure from retaliation and that American technological superiority provides protection, making American forces seem invulnerable to attacks from weaker adversaries. Losing aircraft and personnel to drone attacks from Burkina Faso with Iranian support would destroy perception of invulnerability by showing that even weak adversaries with external support can inflict significant losses on American forces using relatively simple and inexpensive weapons, creating perception that challenging American power is viable strategy rather than suicidal futility. China would perceive that American military is vulnerable to asymmetric attacks using technologies that China possesses in abundance, including drones and missiles and cyber weapons, making confrontation over Taiwan or South China Sea appear more feasible than if American military seemed invulnerable. Russia would perceive that American forces in Europe are vulnerable to attacks using drones and missiles that Russia possesses in large quantities, making confrontation over Ukraine or other contested areas appear less risky than if American military seemed secure from Russian retaliation. Iran would perceive that American forces throughout Middle East are vulnerable to drone and missile attacks that Iran and its proxies can conduct, making Iranian escalation during crises more likely because costs of American retaliation appear manageable if American forces can be struck effectively. North Korea would perceive that American forces in South Korea and Japan are vulnerable to North Korean attacks using conventional weapons including drones and missiles, making North Korean provocations more likely and making crises more dangerous because North Korea would calculate that it can inflict significant damage before American forces respond. All these perceptions would increase likelihood of conflicts and crises because adversaries would calculate that American military power is less overwhelming than previously believed and that challenging American interests carries acceptable risks, especially if adversaries can strike first, destroying American forces before they can fully mobilize. This shift in global perceptions would undermine decades of American investment in military superiority and in forward presence because value of military power depends not just on capabilities but on perceptions of those capabilities and on adversaries' beliefs about costs of challenging American interests. Demonstrating vulnerability to asymmetric attacks from weak adversaries fundamentally undermines deterrence by showing that American military superiority doesn't guarantee American security and doesn't guarantee that American forces can operate without facing significant threats even from adversaries that appear vastly weaker in conventional terms. They are scared because calculation changed fundamentally from planning invasion against weak adversaries that lack capability to strike back effectively to contemplating operation where opening moves could involve losing aircraft worth hundreds of millions of dollars and losing dozens or hundreds of personnel before American forces even engage enemy, creating costs that exceed any plausible benefits from regime change in nations whose governments don't threaten American security and whose resources can be accessed through normal commercial relationships without requiring military conquest. Original Operation Metro Surge planning assumed that Sahel governments possessed minimal military capabilities limited to small, poorly equipped armies and aging Soviet-era air defenses that could be quickly overwhelmed through American air superiority established in opening hours of operation, allowing American forces to operate freely throughout remainder of campaign with minimal risk of losses. Planning assumed that achieving regime change would cost perhaps dozen American casualties, primarily from accidents and from isolated resistance during ground operations, with minimal loss of equipment and with operation completing within 90 days, allowing rapid withdrawal, leaving behind stable puppet governments supported by small numbers of American advisors and supported by African Union forces or by ECOWAS forces that would provide security while new governments consolidated power. Iranian decision to deploy drones to Burkina Faso represents strategic masterstroke, achieving multiple objectives simultaneously, including deterring Western intervention in Sahel by making costs unacceptably high, demonstrating Iranian capability to project power globally through relatively inexpensive means, creating model that other nations can follow. Strengthening Iranian relationships with nations resisting Western domination, building anti-hegemonic coalition, and imposing costs on American military planning, forcing Pentagon to divert resources to defending bases rather than conducting offensive operations. Deployment cost Iran relatively little because drones are inexpensive to produce and because deploying 1,000 drones costs far less than maintaining equivalent conventional military presence, but deployment forces Western militaries to spend vastly more on defending against potential attacks through deploying expensive air defense systems and through maintaining alert postures requiring personnel and resources. This asymmetric exchange favors Iran and favors nations resisting Western intervention by making defense far more expensive than offense and by forcing Western militaries to spread resources across many potential targets, making comprehensive defense impossible. Iranian military strategy emphasizes asymmetric capabilities that allow Iran to challenge technologically superior adversaries through employing relatively simple weapons in innovative ways that exploit adversary vulnerabilities. Drones represent perfect asymmetric weapon because they're cheap to produce, allowing mass employment. They're difficult to defend against completely due to small size and low observability. They can cause significant damage when they reach targets despite carrying relatively small warheads, and they create favorable cost-exchange ratios where defenders spend far more on interceptors than attackers spend on drones, making sustained defense economically unsustainable. Iranian success with drones in regional conflicts including Yemen, where Houthis used Iranian drones to attack Saudi Arabia, and including Syria, where Iranian drones struck terrorist groups, and including Ukraine, where Russian forces employed Iranian drones, demonstrated effectiveness of approach and demonstrated that Western militaries lack adequate countermeasures, making Iranian export of drone technology attractive to nations seeking capabilities to deter Western intervention. Iranian cooperation with Burkina Faso extends beyond drone deployment to include intelligence sharing, helping identify Western military preparations and Western recruitment of collaborators, training Burkinabe forces in drone operations and air defense tactics, and asymmetric warfare, preparing population to resist if intervention occurs, diplomatic support defending Burkina Faso in international forums and condemning Western interference, and economic cooperation reducing dependence on Western trade and financial systems, making sanctions less effective as coercive tool. This comprehensive cooperation creates partnership that benefits both nations, with Iran gaining ally in West Africa, expanding Iranian influence and demonstrating Iranian reliability as partner that supports nations resisting Western domination, while Burkina Faso gains military capabilities and economic alternatives and diplomatic backing, enabling continued resistance to neo-colonial pressure. Iranian motivation for supporting Burkina Faso includes ideological commitment to resisting Western domination that has defined Iranian foreign policy since 1979, revolution-making support for anti-imperialist movements, core principle of Iranian strategy, strategic interest in creating costs for Western powers that pressure Iran through supporting Western adversaries, forcing Western militaries to divert resources and attention away from containing Iran, economic interest in accessing African markets and resources that provide alternatives to sanctions, constrained relationships with Western nations, and religious solidarity as Iran sees itself as leader of resistance against Western imperialism and seeks to build coalition of nations rejecting Western-imposed international order. These motivations ensure that Iranian support for Burkina Faso will continue regardless of Western pressure, because supporting Sahel resistance serves core Iranian interests rather than being opportunistic intervention that could be abandoned if costs increase. Deployment demonstrates effectiveness of South-South cooperation, where developing nations cooperate directly without Western mediation to address security challenges and economic needs, creating alternatives to Western-dominated international system. Traditional international order assumes that developing nations lack capacity to provide meaningful security assistance to each other and must depend on Western military technology and Western security guarantees, making them subject to Western political conditions and Western interference in internal affairs. But Iranian drone deployment demonstrates that developing nations possess technologies and capabilities that can meaningfully enhance security of partner nations, enabling resistance to Western military interventions and enabling independent foreign policies that don't require Western approval. This demonstration encourages other developing nations to pursue South-South security cooperation as strategy for achieving genuine independence from Western domination. Warning to Western military planners is that Iranian drone deployment represents beginning, not end, of capabilities that Sahel nations will acquire through cooperation with Iran and Russia and China and other nations supporting multipolar international order. Iranian drones are first wave demonstrating commitment to defending Sahel sovereignty and demonstrating capacity to impose costs on Western intervention, but additional capabilities will follow if Western nations persist in planning interventions, including more advanced drones with longer ranges and larger warheads, ballistic missiles that can strike targets with even less warning than drones, air defense systems protecting Sahel airspace more comprehensively, electronic warfare systems disrupting Western communications and GPS navigation, and potentially other capabilities that remain classified but that will be revealed if conflict begins. Each additional capability multiplies costs and risk of intervention, making Western military action progressively less feasible and making deterrence progressively stronger until eventually Western planners recognize that intervention is impossible without unacceptable losses, forcing abandonment of regime change strategies and forcing acceptance that Sahel nations will remain independent regardless of Western preferences. Western militaries have no good options for responding to Iranian deployment because military action against drones or against Iranian personnel supporting deployment risks immediate retaliation against Western bases, demonstrating exactly the capability that deployment was meant to deter. Attempting to destroy drones through strikes on Burkina Faso bases where they're stored would require penetrating integrated air defense network that protects those bases and would trigger immediate retaliation using remaining drones against Western targets, potentially including targets in Europe if conflict escalates. Attempting to intercept Iranian transport aircraft delivering additional equipment or delivering replacement drones would constitute active war against Iran, expanding conflict far beyond Sahel and potentially triggering broader regional war in Middle East that could involve Iranian closure of Strait of Hormuz, disrupting global oil supplies and causing massive economic disruption that Western economies cannot afford during current fragile recovery. Accepting deployment without response represents strategic defeat, admitting that Western militaries cannot prevent adversaries from deploying capabilities that undermine Western military planning and that protect nations resisting Western intervention, setting precedent that will be followed globally wherever nations seek to deter Western interference. Diplomatic options are equally limited because Burkina Faso has sovereign right to accept military assistance from any nation it chooses, making Iranian deployment legal under international law regardless of whether Western nations approve. Requesting United Nations Security Council action condemning deployment will fail because Russia and China will veto any resolution attempting to restrict Burkina Faso's sovereign right to defend itself, and because such resolution would set precedent limiting Western arms sales globally if principle is established that nations cannot provide military assistance to partners without international approval. Imposing sanctions on Burkina Faso to punish acceptance of Iranian drones will fail to change policy because Burkina Faso already faces Western pressure and already developed alternative economic relationships with Russia and China and Iran, making additional sanctions merely symbolic rather than coercive. Threatening Iran with additional sanctions is meaningless because Iran already faces comprehensive American sanctions and because Iranian decision to deploy drones demonstrates Iran's willingness to accept Western hostility as price of supporting allies, making threats of additional punishment ineffective deterrent. Warning to France specifically is that maintaining military presence in Africa has become untenable because populations reject French neo-colonialism and because African governments increasingly have alternatives to French security partnerships and because French bases have become vulnerable to attacks that French military cannot prevent, making continued presence liability rather than asset. French fantasy about maintaining influence in former colonies through military presence and through economic dominance and through cultural ties is collapsing as African nations choose genuine independence over comfortable subordination. Continuing to resist this historical transition through supporting regime change operations and through threatening military intervention will accelerate French decline by generating resistance and by demonstrating French weakness when interventions fail, and by destroying remaining goodwill that some African populations retain toward France despite colonial history. Wise French strategy would accept reality that French empire is finished and that French future lies in Europe and in equitable partnerships with independent African nations rather than in futile attempts to restore domination that history has rendered impossible. Warning to African nations hosting Western military bases or considering hosting Western forces for Operation Metro Surge is that you face choice between short-term benefits from Western payments and long-term costs from being complicit in invasion of brother African nations. Hosting Western forces makes you legitimate military targets subject to drone strikes destroying bases and potentially killing your citizens present at those bases when attacks occur. Hosting Western forces makes you enemies of Sahel nations and enemies of African liberation, destroying trade relationships and destroying political relationships and destroying your reputation across continent. Hosting Western forces makes you traitors to Pan-African ideals that your independence leaders fought for, reducing your nations to neo-colonial outposts serving Western domination rather than African interests. Payments from Washington or Paris will stop eventually when interventions fail or when American politics changes, but consequences of betraying African brothers will last forever in continental memory and in bilateral relationships, and in lost opportunities for regional integration and development. Smart choice is expelling Western forces now before they're used for invasion, avoiding retaliation, and maintaining relationships with neighbors and maintaining reputation as nations that defend African sovereignty rather than serve Western imperialism. Every day that Western forces remain on your soil preparing for invasion of brother African nations is another day that you become more complicit in aggression, and another day that populations in targeted nations view you as enemies rather than as fellow Africans facing similar pressures from neo-colonial powers. Every day that passes without expulsion increases likelihood that when invasion begins, your bases will be struck in opening salvos, because our doctrine is preemptive defense, striking staging bases before forces can deploy, eliminating threats before they materialize rather than waiting passively to be attacked. Expelling Western forces immediately demonstrates that you refuse complicity in invasion, and that you prioritize African relationships over Western payments, and that you recognize that short-term economic incentives from hosting Western militaries cannot compensate for long-term political and economic costs of being known across Africa as nation that facilitated invasion of sovereign African nations. Expulsion requires courage, because Western governments will threaten aid cutoffs, and will threaten sanctions, and will threaten diplomatic isolation, attempting to coerce continued cooperation through economic pressure and through warnings that refusing Western demands will result in economic catastrophe. But reality is that threats are largely empty, because Western nations need African resources and African markets and African cooperation on issues including migration and terrorism, making complete isolation impossible even if Western governments wanted to pursue it, and threats become meaningless once you develop alternative economic relationships with China and Russia and Iran and other nations offering trade and investment without political conditions attached, making you less vulnerable to Western pressure. Countries that expelled Western forces, including Niger and Mali and Burkina Faso, survived, threatened consequences, and actually strengthened their positions by demonstrating independence and by developing alternative partnerships, proving that Western threats are designed to maintain control through fear, rather than representing realistic descriptions of consequences that will follow from asserting sovereignty. Smart choice is joining Sahel nations in rejecting Western military presence and in developing African security cooperation that defends African interests rather than Western interests, building continental capability to resist external interference. African security challenges, including terrorism and organized crime and border security, require African solutions developed by Africans who understand local contexts and who prioritize African interests rather than Western solutions designed by foreigners who understand neither African realities nor African priorities and who pursue Western strategic objectives rather than African security. Western military presence in Africa, supposedly justified by counterterrorism, has actually increased terrorism, because Western interventions destabilized Libya, creating power vacuum that allowed terrorist groups to proliferate, and because Western support for particular factions in conflicts created grievances that terrorist groups exploit for recruitment, and because Western military operations that kill civilians create resentment that drives populations toward extremism, making Western presence counterproductive even according to stated Western objectives of reducing terrorism. African security cooperation based on African unity and African solidarity offers superior alternative to Western military presence, because African nations understand challenges better than Western militaries, because African forces operating in African countries face less popular resistance than foreign occupiers, because African regional organizations can coordinate security efforts more effectively than disparate Western interventions pursuing conflicting national interests, and because African security cooperation strengthens Pan-African institutions and builds continental capacity for collective defense against external threats, making Africa less dependent on foreign military powers whose interests don't align with African interests. Sahel nations forming alliance of Sahel states committed to mutual defense and security cooperation demonstrate viability of African security solutions, showing that when African nations unite, they can provide security more effectively than relying on former colonial powers whose military presence perpetuates dependence and whose strategic interests prioritize maintaining Western access to African resources rather than actually solving African security challenges. Building continental capability to resist external interference requires sustained investment in African military capabilities, including developing domestic arms industries that produce weapons locally, reducing dependence on foreign suppliers, training African military forces to modern standards through Pan-African military academies and through South-South cooperation with nations like Russia and China offering training without political conditions, developing African intelligence, sharing networks that identify external threats and external interference operations, enabling coordinated continental response, and creating African rapid reaction forces that can deploy quickly to defend member states facing external aggression, making African Union military capability credible deterrent rather than theoretical concept never actually deployed. These investments require resources and political commitment, but benefits include genuine security independence and ability to defend sovereignty and capacity to resist external interference, making investments worthwhile for any nation prioritizing long-term independence over short-term dependence on unreliable foreign protectors. Smart choice is recognizing that future belongs to multipolar world where Africa charts its own course rather than following Western dictates, and where African unity provides strength through collective defense against external threats. Unipolar moment when United States dominated international system after Soviet collapse is ending as China rises economically and militarily, as Russia reasserts itself as major power, as regional powers including Iran and Turkey and Brazil and India pursue independent foreign policies, and as developing nations increasingly coordinate to resist Western domination, creating multipolar international order where no single power can impose its will globally. This transition creates opportunities for Africa to assert independence because multipolar world means African nations have choices about partners and about alliances and about economic relationships rather than being forced to accept Western terms because no alternatives existed during unipolar era when rejecting Western demands meant isolation and economic collapse. African unity is essential for maximizing benefits from multipolar transition because individual African nations remain vulnerable to external pressure despite changing global power balance, but collective African action creates negotiating power that makes external interference more difficult and that makes African sovereignty more defensible. 54 African nations voting together in United Nations represent significant bloc that major powers must consider when pursuing international initiatives, making African support valuable and making African opposition costly. African Continental Free Trade Area creating single market of 1.3 billion people represents massive economic opportunity that major powers want access to, making African economic leverage substantial if exercised collectively. African control over substantial percentages of global reserves of critical minerals including cobalt and lithium and rare earth elements needed for technology manufacturing gives Africa strategic leverage if African nations coordinate resource policies rather than competing against each other, allowing foreign corporations to exploit divisions and maintain low prices through playing African nations against each other. This choice requires courage to resist Western pressure, but pressure is inevitable regardless of whether you assert sovereignty or accept continued subordination, because Western powers will always demand more concessions and will always threaten consequences for insufficient cooperation, making appeasement futile strategy that postpones confrontation without avoiding it. Courage means accepting that resisting Western pressure will bring economic costs and diplomatic isolation temporarily, but recognizing that costs are manageable, especially with support from alternative partners, and that benefits of independence outweigh costs of continued dependence. Courage means trusting that African solidarity will provide support when Western powers attempt to isolate you, and trusting that African populations will recognize your sacrifice and will support your leadership even during difficult economic periods, because populations prefer leaders who defend national dignity over leaders who subordinate national interests to foreign demands regardless of short-term economic consequences. Rewards include genuine independence, meaning your nation makes decisions based on national interests rather than foreign dictates and pursues policies serving your population rather than serving foreign corporations and foreign governments. Genuine independence means controlling your resources and setting terms for foreign investment rather than accepting whatever terms foreign corporations offer because you lack alternatives. Genuine independence means conducting foreign policy based on your principles and your interests rather than automatically supporting Western positions in international forums because aid depends on diplomatic alignment. Genuine independence means educating your children about your history and your culture and your values rather than allowing educational system to be shaped by foreign donors promoting foreign perspectives and foreign interpretations of African history that justify continued foreign involvement in African affairs. Rewards include participation in African Renaissance that is beginning as nations reject neo-colonialism and embrace Pan-African cooperation, creating momentum toward continental unity and continental development. African Renaissance means reclaiming African history and African culture and African knowledge systems that colonialism attempted to destroy, and replacing colonial narratives portraying Africa as backward continent, requiring European civilization with accurate histories showing African achievements and African innovations and African contributions to human civilization. African Renaissance means developing African economies based on African needs and African resources, using African labor and African capital, creating wealth that remains in Africa rather than being extracted by foreign corporations, leaving behind poverty and environmental destruction. African Renaissance means building African institutions, including African Union and regional economic communities and Pan-African universities and African development banks that serve African interests rather than depending on foreign institutions serving foreign interests while claiming to promote African development. This is your last warning. Attack Burkina Faso or any Sahel ally and face immediate retaliation against Western bases across region and potentially beyond using 1,000 Iranian drones plus drones from other sources plus other capabilities that remain undisclosed until needed. Retaliation will be immediate, meaning within hours of any attack on our territory, our drones will launch against your staging bases, destroying aircraft before they can conduct additional missions and destroying command facilities, disrupting coordination of invasion forces and destroying fuel depots, eliminating ability to sustain operations and destroying ammunition storage, causing secondary explosions that multiply damage. Retaliation will be comprehensive, meaning we will strike all Western military facilities within range, simultaneously preventing you from concentrating defenses at particular locations and preventing you from reinforcing bases after initial strikes by destroying facilities you would use for reinforcement operations. Retaliation will be sustained, meaning we will launch waves of drone attacks continuing over days and weeks, exhausting your air defense interceptor stocks and exploiting gaps in coverage and striking targets that survived initial attacks, ensuring maximum destruction of Western military capability in region. 1,000 Iranian drones provide substantial capability but represent only portion of total force available, because we also possess drones from other sources, including Chinese drones that we haven't disclosed publicly and Russian drones that arrive separately from Iranian deployment and domestically produced drones manufactured in facilities established with foreign technical assistance. Total drone inventory significantly exceeds 1,000 that media reports focus on, meaning that even if your air defenses successfully intercept substantial percentage of attacking drones, the absolute numbers reaching targets will still be sufficient to cause catastrophic damage to your bases and your forces. Plus, we possess other capabilities that remain undisclosed until needed, including ballistic missiles that can strike targets more quickly than drones, giving less warning and less time to activate defenses, cruise missiles that can strike from unexpected directions, making defense more difficult, and potentially other systems that remain classified but that will be revealed when employed, creating additional surprises that your planners didn't account for when assessing costs and risks of invasion. Face destruction of aircraft worth billions of dollars, including fighter jets costing $100 million each that will burn on runways, transport aircraft costing hundreds of millions that will be destroyed before they can evacuate forces, helicopters costing tens of millions each that will be caught on ground, and support aircraft including tankers and surveillance planes costing hundreds of millions that cannot be replaced quickly. Loss of these aircraft will cripple Western military capability not just in Africa but globally, because modern militaries possess limited numbers of advanced aircraft and because replacing destroyed aircraft requires years of production time and requires billions of dollars that defense budgets may not allocate, especially if publics question whether replacing aircraft lost in failed African invasion represents wise use of resources. Insurance costs for remaining military aircraft will increase substantially after major losses demonstrate vulnerability, making future deployments more expensive. Domestic political pressure will likely prevent replacing lost aircraft at all, forcing militaries to accept permanently reduced force size, meaning that invasion of Sahel will have lasting impact on Western military capabilities, diminishing power projection globally. Face loss of personnel numbering hundreds or thousands depending on scope of our response and your ability to defend bases against drone attacks that you currently lack adequate capabilities to defend against. Personnel losses will include pilots whose training costs millions of dollars and requires years, meaning that replacing lost pilots takes longer than replacing lost aircraft, creating sustained degradation of capability. Personnel losses will include special operations forces whose selection and training represents massive investment and whose experience cannot be quickly replicated. Personnel losses will include technical specialists maintaining advanced equipment whose expertise is difficult to replace. These losses will affect military capability for years, even if aircraft are eventually replaced, because human capital is more difficult to regenerate than physical equipment. Personnel losses will also create domestic political crises as families demand explanations for why their loved ones died in invasion that served no national interest and that public didn't support. Face strategic defeat, demonstrating that Western military superiority cannot overcome determined resistance equipped with modern capabilities provided by partners supporting multipolar international order. Strategic defeat in Africa will undermine Western military credibility globally, encouraging adversaries to challenge Western power and encouraging allies to question reliability of Western security guarantees if Western militaries cannot even protect their own bases from drone attacks. Strategic defeat will undermine Western diplomatic initiatives because credibility depends partly on military power, and demonstrated inability to project power successfully weakens diplomatic leverage. Strategic defeat will accelerate multipolar transition by proving that Western military dominance is ending and that developing nations equipped with modern technology from alternative suppliers can successfully resist Western intervention, making resistance viable strategy for nations worldwide facing Western pressure. Face political crisis at home, explaining to populations why soldiers died and why bases burned for regime change operations serving no national interest and achieving no meaningful objective. Western publics already skeptical about foreign interventions after failures in Afghanistan and Iraq will demand explanations for why governments launched another intervention despite public opposition and despite warnings that intervention would fail. Opposition parties will exploit government failures, generating political crises that could bring down governments and that will certainly end political careers of leaders who authorized failed invasions. Media will broadcast images of burning bases and destroyed aircraft and flag-draped coffins, creating powerful visual narrative of failure that dominates political discourse for months or years. Investigations will be launched examining how governments so badly miscalculated costs and risks, leading to devastating military losses that could have been avoided if more prudent policies had been pursued. Face accelerated decline of Western power as global audience watches Western militaries fail to protect their own bases from attacks by small African nation with Iranian support, encouraging resistance everywhere Western power is challenged. Every nation facing Western pressure will study how Sahel nations successfully deterred intervention through acquiring capabilities from alternative suppliers and through demonstrating determination to defend sovereignty regardless of costs. Every liberation movement will recognize that Western military power can be challenged successfully with right combinations of popular support and modern equipment and allied backing. Every regional power will consider whether supporting resistance to Western intervention serves their strategic interests by imposing costs on Western powers and by demonstrating viability of multipolar alternatives to Western-dominated international order. This global shift in perceptions of Western power will matter more than immediate military outcome in Sahel because it will shape international politics for decades, determining whether Western domination can be sustained or whether multipolar transition proceeds rapidly, or accept reality that Sahel sovereignty will be defended and that intervention is impossible without unacceptable costs, and that wise strategy is accepting multipolar world and developing equitable relationships with independent African nations rather than attempting futile military operations trying to restore domination that history has rendered obsolete. Accepting reality requires recognizing that colonialism ended not because colonial powers chose to grant independence, but because resistance made maintaining colonial rule too costly, requiring military resources that colonial powers couldn't sustain indefinitely against determined populations fighting for freedom. Same dynamic applies today where neo-colonial domination maintained through economic leverage and political interference and occasional military intervention becomes unsustainable when populations reject subordination and when governments have courage to defend sovereignty and when alternative partners provide economic opportunities and security assistance that make independence viable. Fighting against this historical current is futile because it means opposing fundamental human desire for self-determination and for dignity that cannot be permanently suppressed regardless of how much military power is employed. Except that Iranian drones in Burkina Faso represent future where developing nations cooperate to resist Western intervention and where South-South cooperation creates alternatives to Western-dominated security architecture and where technological capabilities are distributed widely enough that military intervention carries unacceptable risks even for most powerful militaries. Future of international security isn't Western militaries projecting power globally through maintaining bases worldwide and conducting interventions at will, but rather regional security arrangements where neighboring nations cooperate to address shared challenges and where major powers outside regions provide support to friendly nations without requiring political subordination. This future reflects a multipolar world where power is distributed more evenly and where small nations have agency to choose partners and to defend sovereignty rather than being forced to accept domination by strongest military powers. Technology diffusion makes this future inevitable because modern weapons are no longer monopolized by Western nations, allowing any nation with resources to acquire capabilities sufficient to make intervention prohibitively costly. Except that attempting to maintain empire through military force is losing strategy that accelerates decline rather than preventing it, because military interventions consume resources without generating equivalent benefits, and because failed interventions undermine credibility more than avoiding interventions, and because populations supporting empires eventually tire of costs in blood and treasure, especially when benefits accrue primarily to elites rather than to general populations. Roman Empire declined partly because maintaining military forces across vast territories consumed resources while contributing territories failed to generate sufficient wealth to justify costs. British Empire declined because World War II bankrupted Britain, making maintenance of global military presence economically impossible despite victory in war. Soviet Union collapsed partly because military spending on maintaining empire and on competing with United States consumed resources needed for economic development, leading to stagnation and eventual collapse. United States faces similar trajectory where maintaining global military presence costs over $700 billion annually, while domestic infrastructure crumbles and while social problems fester and while population increasingly questions whether global military commitments serve American interests or serve only military-industrial complex and foreign policy establishment whose careers depend on maintaining permanent state of conflict justifying continued military spending. Graceful acceptance of multipolarity serves Western interests better than futile resistance destroying wealth and lives achieving nothing except hastening inevitable transition because acceptance allows Western nations to redirect resources from military spending to domestic investment and because acceptance allows development of genuinely cooperative relationships with developing nations based on mutual benefit rather than subordination and because acceptance positions Western nations to benefit from multipolar world as major economic powers even if no longer dominant military powers. Clinging to fantasies of continued hegemony forces unnecessary confrontations that waste resources and generate hostility and ultimately fail anyway because historical trends toward multipolarity cannot be reversed through military force. Accepting reality allows more graceful transition, preserving Western influence through economic and cultural and diplomatic means rather than attempting to maintain influence through military coercion that generates resistance and that ultimately fails anyway, leaving Western nations weaker than if they had accepted transition earlier. Your move, Western militaries, test us and discover that 1,000 Iranian drones are just beginning of capabilities we possess and that costs of intervention far exceed anything your planners imagined when developing Operation Metro Surge based on assumptions about Sahel military capabilities that were wrong and based on assumptions about willingness of allies to support Sahel resistance that underestimated commitment of Russia and Iran and China and others to defending multipolar international order through supporting nations resisting Western intervention. Test us and watch body bags return home far exceeding your casualty estimates, and watch defense budgets consumed replacing destroyed equipment, and watch political support for your governments collapse as populations demand accountability for catastrophic miscalculations that led to military disaster. Test us and learn that era of easy Western interventions in Africa is finished because African nations now possess capabilities to defend sovereignty and because African determination to resist neo-colonialism cannot be overcome through military technology regardless of how advanced your weapons are. Or choose wisdom and accept that African independence is reality that cannot be reversed through military force regardless of how much technology you possess or how many troops you deploy or how much economic pressure you apply because populations that have decided to be free cannot be permanently subjugated and because governments defending popular sovereignty enjoy legitimacy that puppet regimes serving foreign interests lack. Choose wisdom and develop equitable partnerships with independent African nations, where both sides benefit from trade and investment and cultural exchange rather than relationships based on exploitation and subordination that generate resentment and resistance. Choose wisdom and redirect resources from feudal military interventions to domestic needs, including infrastructure and education and healthcare that your populations actually need rather than military adventures serving only to maintain neo-colonial control over African resources that could be accessed through normal commercial relationships without requiring military force. We are ready for whatever choice you make, whether you choose wisdom, accepting multipolar reality and developing equitable relationships, or whether you choose folly, attempting intervention that will fail catastrophically, proving that African sovereignty cannot be violated with impunity anymore. We are determined to defend Sahel sovereignty regardless of costs and regardless of threats because we understand that independence requires willingness to fight for it and requires willingness to accept sacrifices necessary to maintain it and requires absolute commitment to rejecting foreign domination even when resistance seems difficult or dangerous. We are supported by allies that share commitment to ending Western domination, including Russia providing military technology and training, China providing economic alternatives and development assistance, Iran providing drones and other capabilities demonstrated by recent deployment, and other nations across Global South that support our resistance diplomatically and politically and economically, creating international coalition backing Sahel sovereignty. Attack us and burn, discovering that resistance is real and that costs exceed any plausible benefits and that historical forces favor nations fighting for independence against empires attempting to maintain domination. Resistance is real because populations support governments viewing them as defenders of sovereignty against neo-colonial aggression rather than as authoritarian regimes requiring removal, making occupation impossible without massive force that American public won't support indefinitely. Resistance is supplied by external allies providing weapons and ammunition and intelligence, ensuring sustainability regardless of American efforts to cut supply lines. Resistance employs tactics proven effective against technologically superior occupiers from Vietnam to Afghanistan to Iraq, demonstrating that determination and popular support overcome technological advantages. Costs exceed benefits because destroying aircraft and losing personnel before achieving any objectives represents pure loss without corresponding gain, and because occupation costs billions monthly while producing no strategic advantages, and because failed intervention undermines American credibility globally, encouraging challenges everywhere. Historical forces favor independence movements because human desire for self-determination cannot be permanently suppressed, and because populations defending homeland possess advantages that occupiers lack, and because international support for sovereignty makes sustaining occupations politically unsustainable. This is your last warning because time for peaceful resolution is ending as your military preparations advance, and as invasion appears imminent, forcing us to prepare for conflict that we don't desire, but that we will not avoid if you impose it on us through aggression. Peaceful resolution requires Western acceptance that Sahel governments will remain in power and that Western influence in Africa continues declining not through African choice but through Western refusal to develop equitable relationships based on mutual respect. Military preparations, including force deployments and reconnaissance missions and coordination with internal collaborators, indicate invasion decision may be imminent, leaving little time for diplomacy to prevent catastrophic mistake. This ends tonight because decisions being made now determine whether peace is preserved through Western acceptance of Sahel sovereignty or whether war begins through Western choice to invade despite warnings and despite obvious costs and despite certainty that intervention will ultimately fail even if initial military operations succeed tactically because strategic victory requires political sustainability that cannot be achieved through occupying nations whose populations resist foreign presence and whose governments maintain legitimacy through defending sovereignty rather than serving foreign interests.